My name is Monica Montgomery, and along with Maddie Thompson, I am one of the co-chairs of this year's 2019 Notre Dame Student Peace Conference. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to any of you that are joining us for the first time today. For those who have been with us all weekend, thank you for all the conversations and the great participation. It's been wonderful, and we look forward to continuing it this afternoon. This afternoon, we are beyond excited to welcome our keynote speaker, Ms. Delaney Tarr, a graduate of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and co-founder of March for Our Lives. On February 14, 2018, a gunman opened fire at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, taking the lives of 17 students and staff members and injuring 17 others. Following this tragic shooting, a group of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School students came together to ensure that what happened at their school never happened again. Out of this group, March for Our Lives was born. On March 24, 2018, the March for Our Lives took place in Washington, D.C., and around the world in over 880 sibling events to demand direct action to fight against gun violence in all its forms. Since last March, the group has expanded their coalitions and worked with new advocates in order to ensure that the march creates a movement, not just a moment. With the Road to Change tour this past summer and the Vote for Our Lives tour this past fall, March for Our Lives is particularly focused on getting young people educated, registered, and motivated to vote. We are honored to welcome Delaney Tarr to stage today at our Notre Dame Student Peace Conference to share about her journey and her work with March for Our Lives. She works with the organization in gun violence prevention and voter registration, as well as youth empowerment. She is a passionate feminist and focuses much of her work through the lens of women's rights. Delaney is currently a journalism major at the University of Georgia. Her activism since February 2018, just over 1 year ago, has taken her around the world. She has been a part of conversations in countless interviews and political office, and even appeared on Jimmy Fallon and Ellen DeGeneres. She traveled with her colleagues to accept the 2018 International Children's Peace Prize in Cape Town, South Africa this past November, which was presented by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Her work for change to increase gun safety in the United States through March for Our Lives has inspired high school students and others around the world to take a stand and become involved in movements of change. This organization also played a key role in the 2018 midterm elections, which saw many gun safety advocates being elected to office. A co-founder for the March for Our Lives was an obvious choice for this year's keynote speaker, as our conference theme focuses on the obstacles that polarization poses to peace and opportunities that inclusivity offer in building a strategic peace. March for Our Lives is redefining power and inserting a new narrative into a polarized situation. We are also very excited to have the voice of a student activist represented as our keynote speaker to demonstrate how our generation can presently work for an inclusive peace. One final logistical note. Following her remarks, Delaney has graciously welcomed time for audience Q&A. So we will be passing around 2 portable microphones in order for participants to pose these questions. If you would like to ask a question, please simply raise your hand during the time allotted for Q&A, and we will do our best to give you the opportunity. The session is being recorded for public viewing, so please be sure to speak clearly into the microphone. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Delaney Tarr to the 2019 Notre Dame Student Peace Conference.
So that was quite the intro. Thank you for hyping me up better than I ever could myself. I would like to start off by saying, I am obviously a student. I am not a member of the academia. I don't have a thesis to present. I am not even by many standards considered an expert in any field. However, I have a story to tell, a story that started little over a year ago. Little over a year ago, I helped lead the March for Our Lives, the March on Washington, D.C. So much has been accomplished since then, some of it mentioned just moments ago. We registered over 85,000 gun violence prevention voters. We've passed over 68 state gun violence prevention laws. We've doubled youth voter turnout. We had a bus tour. We voted out more NRA pawns than ever before. But to understand the successes that we've had, we need to look to the past, to the beginning. Because as unfortunate as it is, the March for Our Lives was something that was formed out of tragedy. A tragedy that hit in our home, Parkland, Florida, in a school widely regarded to be an incredible public school with many opportunities and different programs, a school that was destroyed for all intents and purposes by one day, one person, and one weapon. A few days after the shooting, 3, I believe, we had a rally at a courthouse in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, just 30 minutes from Parkland. We had that rally, and my friend Emma Gonzalez, I don't know if you know her, gave her famous "We Call BS" speech. I gave a much less famous speech there as well. I gave a speech, it wasn't as popular, but that's okay. That's okay, because the truth is that speech, that gave us so much more traction than we could ever imagine. Because up until that moment, we were just another statistic. We were just another group of students going through the grief and the pain that so many have before, hoping, praying, and fighting for something different, for a future that maybe doesn't have to be so bleak. And that day, and from every day after that, we understood that we had power, that we had an ability to change the landscape, to change the world even. We sat down that night on Cameron Caskey's living room floor after a very intense interview, and we realized that we would become the March for Our Lives. It started off as a march. 1 month from the day that we decided to do it, we decided we were going to have a march on Washington with about 1 million people, and let me tell you, that is not easy. Most people don't plan marches in a month. That's not a thing, but we decided to do it. We also realized that there was a lot that inspired us. We are obviously not the only group that has mobilized in such a grassroots way. We've had many different organizations as our predecessors. We've been inspired by the civil rights movement, by the anti-war protests, by even the Me Too movement. These are all new forms of power, power dedicated to people. We oftentimes abide specifically by MLK's principles of nonviolence. The most significant to us was the fact that it was about defeating injustice, not people. We took that to heart every day, and we reminded that we were fighting the core of injustice, not the people who have perpetrated it. We were fighting the NRA, we were fighting corruption and the systems that put it in place, not the people who become victims to it, not the people who have subscribed to a system that they don't know an alternative to. And I think that's really what carried us so far, was looking to the past, but also realizing that we had a different future that we could pursue. Realizing that we were not the same as movements before us because we were in a new world, a new way to navigate the world even. I call it new power. It's a term that I've heard many times before, new political power, new social power, but it's true. We had new power, specifically in terms of social media. I mean, movements of the past weren't able to send out a tweet and have it go viral, but we did. We gained platforms in a matter of weeks. I went from having 500 to 500 or 50,000. It was kind of overwhelming, I'm not gonna lie, because I just wanted to tweet memes. But we understood that people were listening. They were listening on the television screens. They were listening on our Twitter feeds. They were listening, and it was an incredible thing to have that power. And it was incredible to know that we had a lot to do with that power. We had to clarify. We are not PACs. We are not politicians. We're people, young people, and people that have been underestimated over and over. People that have been criticized for our very use of Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat, yet those were the tools that propelled us to where we were. We were criticized for being lazy and aimless and too focused on this magical world that doesn't exist, yet that very ideology is what pushed us to make the place better. We are not PACs, we are not politicians. We knew we had a responsibility to be better, to be more inclusive, to be more grassroots. We are obviously an organization that founded out of Parkland, Florida. We are a primarily white institution, and that was something that we were very cognizant of moving in. And as soon as we were given the opportunity, we decided to focus on gun violence more than just mass shootings, but in every format and every place. Gun violence is an epidemic not just in schools, but in streets, in churches, in synagogues, anywhere. People can't walk around in many communities without fear of being shot, and that was not okay. That is not okay. We had to acknowledge the fact that communities of color are disproportionately more affected by gun violence. Urban areas, are disproportionately more affected by gun violence. And for us to stand there as a group of privileged white kids and simply say that we were the solution, it was not only unrealistic, but it was damaging. So we took our tenets, we took our new power, and we searched for something more. We brought in speakers from all across the country, some including Edna Chavez from California, Trayvon Bosley from Chicago, because they experience gun violence too, but in a different way, in a way that impacts them just as much, in a way that unites us in a cause, but is navigated differently. And as we met them and we bonded with them and we understood that their stories held so much power and strength, we learned that there was a lot more work to be done, that we had to pass on our platform to other people, that we had to move beyond just one march, one day of calling out politicians and the NRA, and keep going. So, keep going we did. We aren't just a march. Yes, our name is March for Our Lives. It'd be hard to rebrand at this point. We tried to rebrand, and then we realized that was a mistake, because the truth is, we weren't marching necessarily on Washington, but every day was a march, every day was a fight. We went on a bus tour called The Road to Change. We spent an entire summer in what is a very small tour bus with each other, going to different cities and states every day to talk to different communities, to understand the different landscapes that we had to navigate and communicate with. Because a small town in Georgia isn't necessarily going to receive your words the same way that New York might. And it was educational, it was inspiring. It showed us that everybody had their own experiences that were inherently valid, that were inherently powerful, but also that everybody all across the country had been mobilizing in their own rights. It was mentioned before that we had over 880 sibling marches across the world, and they did not stop after March 24th. They formed local chapters. They partnered with organizations like Everytown, with organizations like the Brady Campaign, to create a system, to create a network of advocacy and activism. We learned that there was a future that was not necessarily reliant on us, the few kids who originally sat on that living room floor, and that was really what gave us hope. It gave us hope and it gave us power. After that tour, where we talked to so many counter-protesters, we learned a lot of the opposing perspectives. Personally, I was on the Florida tour, so I went to some very interesting places in Florida. We once talked to a man named Solo. His name was Solo. He approached me and he said, "Why do you want to take guns away from women who need it to defend themselves from a sexual assaulter?" A question like that is a softball, really, because all it does is bring home the point that we're not trying to take guns away from everyone. We simply wanted to put them in the hands of people who were responsible, who needed them. And of course, as a staunch feminist, I support women defending themselves in legal and responsible scenarios. So to get to talk to people like that, people who disagreed oftentimes because of perception, because of this incorrect idea of who we are and what we stood for, I think it not only unified us and educated us, it also showed how many more people there were out there who could get behind our message of gun violence prevention legislation, of our 10 policy points on our website that we would point to at any given moment to tell people that they can support any of them, that they can push for them. Of course, there is a distinct way that you can achieve those policy points, and we were very aware of the fact that we were not legislators, and we didn't always get along with a lot of legislators. They didn't want to listen to us. People don't want to listen to broad, controversial ideas of change oftentimes, but we knew that the true power lied in the ballot box. So we became a march to the ballot box, a march to the polls. We started pushing for voter registration on that tour. We created t-shirts, unfortunately I'm not wearing one today, with a QR code that would register people to vote. Thank you for the thumbs up, I feel validated. We registered, as I said, over 85,000 gun violence prevention voters, and we did it in a way that was accessible. We showed the importance of voting not just in a general election, but in every single election, in a mayoral race where you might not even know the candidates that well, to the presidential race. Every single one was important, every single one was impactful. We had to nail that message home because truly it was the basis of our democracy. It still is. And it may not be exciting, but we decided to make voting exciting, to shift not just the policy points, but the cultural discourse around gun violence prevention, around civic engagement. One of our biggest strategies was PSAs. We did one with the Avengers, which was wild. We created a PSA with the Avengers because we knew how to speak to young people. Unlike many corporations, we were a group of teenagers talking to teenagers, and we understood that they didn't want any sort of cliche attempt at trying to be relatable and one of the cool kids. They wanted something genuine, and we were there to provide it. We did that PSA where we talked about our first times. Yes, innuendo. Super fun, super great, and we realized that people were being receptive to more than just one form of activism. They wanted to register to vote, and when they saw that PSA, they felt a little bit more inspired to do so. So we kept moving. I got to go on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon and talk with Mark Ruffalo and Jimmy Fallon about that PSA, which, once again, wild. It's a big word that I use to explain a lot of my experiences. And we pushed that message out even more. We released a book. Crazy. And it was a New York Times best-selling book that basically shared our stories and the behind-the-scenes aspect of the march to show our human side, to show really how easy and accessible it is to do the work that we were doing. We changed the narrative, and that in itself was wildly powerful. It showed that we weren't just a march, that we were so much more. So after those PSAs, after releasing the book that we promptly forgot about, we went on another tour. This time to colleges, because truly colleges are an incredibly important place for politics and political discourse. So the week before midterms, we went on a college tour. We registered even more people, if we could, and we bussed them directly to the polls on buses with stripper poles. That was an accident, but it did happen. We would have parties, we would have rallies, we would do whatever it would take to show people that politics isn't just important, it's also fun sometimes. You don't have to view it as this dreadful, inaccessible thing, because really, that's what the systems have been created to do. They oftentimes would push young people, they would push marginalized groups and oppressed groups out of politics because they know that our voices are powerful. We had to put that power back into people, back into young people, show them that they could change the landscape of politics, and change they did. We created chapters. Well, more appropriately, the students across the country created chapters, and we merely cheered them on. We created an infrastructure to show just how important and powerful it could be to have, say, a group in Arizona create legislation on a state level. We didn't understand how every state operated. We're from Florida. That's its own place. We knew that each person had an ability, a special ability, to communicate with the people in their vicinity more effectively than we could. We don't necessarily know how to navigate every political landscape, and there is a lot of variety in such political landscapes. For example, I don't necessarily know how to communicate effectively to South Bend, Indiana. I know how to communicate effectively to South Florida, which is why we needed people on every level, in every city in America, even across the world, to be able to understand and navigate their community effectively. And it worked. Like I said, over 68 state gun violence prevention laws, and even more city ordinances. And that was truly a feat in itself, because we learned that, like I said before, the organization was sustainable. It was sustainable beyond just us. It was just sustainable beyond the state of Florida. It was everywhere. Some of our most powerful chapters are in other states. We have the Arizona branch, as I said. We have Chicago. We have New York. We have them in smaller cities and bigger cities. We have them everywhere. There's even a chapter in Amsterdam. I don't know why, but there is a chapter in Amsterdam. And consistently, it's been proven to us that we are not the outliers. We often get called the outliers. People call us superheroes. They say that we're doing the impossible, that, oh my God, I thought all kids your age were just lazy. And we've had to prove them wrong. We've had to show them, look, we're just some of them. Look at how many other students there are. And it is unfortunate that that is a true stereotype, that it's one that exists and permeates so much of our discourse, but we've been combating it. Not just us. Other organizations have been combating it as well. The youth environmental movement is one that we've run in with a lot, because there's so much overlap in the fact that youth activists are taking on so many different issues. Because we've recognized the intersectionality of pretty much everything in America, and the fact that education and women's rights and environmental justice, gun violence prevention, they're all intersecting. They're not separate. No issue in America is separate. And we really, truly had to address them all. That in itself was a huge propeller towards midterms. Maybe midterms didn't always go our way. We recognize that. We knew that there were some elections where gun sense candidates lost, where they were beat out by NRA-funded politicians. And we knew that was going to happen, because change doesn't happen overnight. One election wasn't going to solve everything. It did solve a lot. It elected a lot of incredible gun sets candidates into office and voted out many NRA pawns. But we couldn't rely on it. We couldn't rely on November 6th to be the end-all, be-all of gun violence. We had to keep working. We still are working. After that day, we picked ourselves up, dusted ourselves off, thought, yeah, some of it sucks, but we gotta keep going. And keep going we did. We put even more effort and time into our chapter structures. We focused on really building out different town halls, different ways to communicate with people. Social media, we had to implement even more. Different events, creative events even. Because really, it was more than just that policy shift, which we are receiving. It was a cultural shift as well. A few days ago, we had an art installation in Washington, D.C. That art installation was not necessarily one that focused specifically on legislation, but one that focused on the human side of it all, and how many people have died because of this. Because I think it's easy to forget that when you work in a movement like this, it's not about just a hypothetical, it's life or death. And we've remembered that. We have to keep remembering that, as hard as it may be. We showed that art installation, and it's not all that we've done, but it impacted people. It hit home a little bit more. We've also pursued legislation. One of the members of our group is 17, and he's a federally registered lobbyist, and he is out there hanging out with some of the most powerful people in government and getting things passed. He is pretty much single-handedly responsible for some of the biggest pieces of legislation that we've seen. He'll be like, oh yeah, universal background checks, I've got this. The next day it's introduced. And that is what we need to cultivate and nurture. Because truly, the young people are the future, yeah, whatever. They're also the present. The young people aren't waiting. We're not waiting to be told that it's our turn to be in charge. We're not waiting to be told that it's okay for us to make a difference, because we can do it right now and damn well are doing it right now. We don't need to be politicians. We don't need to be PACs. We simply need to be us, and that's enough. It is enough to be who you are, to channel activism through whatever way you want to. There's no right or wrong way to make a difference. If you're an artist, create a painting, send a message. If you're a public speaker, get up on a stage and run a rally. If you're an organizer, organize a march. There's no wrong way, there's no right way, there is just the way to change. Change for a better tomorrow, for peace, for prosperity, for an America that we deserve, for the America we need. Thank you. I'm going to take some questions now, so talk to me.
So looking ahead, I was just wondering, as the movement as a whole, where do you see it going in the next 4 years?
Right, absolutely. So in terms of the movement as a whole, one of the ultimate goals of the March for Our Lives is to not have to exist anymore. We don't necessarily know the timetable on that, but we want to be obsolete. We want gun violence to not be an issue in America. In coming years, like I said, our biggest focus is building out chapters and really understanding that having that network and those different local activists on every level be able to pass legislation and create rhetorical change in their own communities it's necessary, and it's the most effective thing that we can do. We're also looking at passing a lot of legislation on the federal level, which is why we've created a lot of different lobbying groups. We've hosted lobbying days. We've hosted receptions for different candidates, simply to get an in so that we can communicate with them, especially with the new Congress. Of course, As the presidential elections come up, we will push for voter registration once again. We will push for voter awareness. I mean, 2020 is a huge deal. But beyond that, it's simply finding new channels to create change and to promote change, be it through art, or artivism, as we like to call it, be it through different conglomerates of youth meeting up and having open discussions and panels similar to this. Really, whatever channel we think of, we pretty much pursue it. Anybody else? I see hands.
What is the primary factor for gun violence?
What do you mean by primary factor?
What causes it? How do we target the actual driving factors?
Well, I think it's interesting because we definitely did start off specifically looking at a policy standpoint and policies that would prevent people from accessing guns in ways that they shouldn't be able to, prevent people who shouldn't have guns from having them in the first place. But as we moved on, we noticed that it's a lot of the rhetoric around the way that we approach guns in America, and the fact that they are so intertwined with a lot of our culture, with a lot of masculinity specifically. And the fact that it is more than just policy, it is a wide breadth of issues in America and the way it's been founded and the way it's consistently pursued the discussion around guns. Oftentimes it's used in terms of protecting yourself or in fighting off the government sometimes. It's about hunting, it's about personal liberties and rights. And there's all different conversations around guns in America, but one of the ones that we've noticed the most is an inherent fear in the government overreaching. Gun violence in America has persisted because of a lot of different issues, because of class, because of race, because of masculinity, as I said before, because of mental health. And truly, it is not one simple thing. It is this intersection of so many different issues, which is why it's near impossible to look at it as it's this standalone issue. It's come together through so many problems in America.
Okay. So I find that in an academic environment, I'm much more comfortable navigating this discussion. I think when I'm talking, to put it bluntly, when I'm talking with people that I don't really give a shit about, it's really easy to be bold and to say what I really think. Mm-hmm. But I find that the hardest area to navigate this dialogue is in my personal life when I'm interacting with people who I deeply care about who think radically differently than I do. So I was wondering if you could speak to how you, especially after you've gone through this process and really educated yourself, how do you kind of refine that and navigate those discussions with people in your personal life?
Right. I think largely it is contextual in the way that you navigate such a discussion. I mean, me standing up here on a stage, I'm going to communicate differently than I would to, say, somebody in one of my classes who I have to sit next to every day for a semester. For me, what I've learned is the fact that conversation is the foundation of change. And you cannot go into a conversation listening to respond, you must listen to learn. Really, I think a lot of activism has a tendency to exist in echo chambers, where we only talk to people that either we will never see again or people who agree with us. And that is not the reality of America. There is a lot of different perspectives and experiences and viewpoints, and we must treat them all as valid in their own right. We have to talk to people not like they are the enemy, but like they are us. Because truly, that othering, that sense of us versus them is, yes, it's prevalent up there in the very top of politics, but it doesn't need to be prevalent in personal discourse. When you have those conversations, yes, it sucks to have people not agree with you, but going about it in a way that is inherently more calm, more open, maybe even ready to learn from some of their opinions. I think that is the best way to go about it. You can't make everybody agree with you. It's something I've had to learn over time, is that sometimes people will just have viewpoints that will be so personally ingrained that you won't be able to change it, but finding common ground is always possible, even if it's on the most simple of things. We talked to the Utah Gun Exchange, an organization that followed us to multiple stops on tour in an armed car and just tried to intimidate us. We sat down with them and we agreed on nothing policy-wise. However, we agreed that we wanted a safer, more peaceful America where people could express their opinions, where people could vote and get engaged. And that, even just that basis, is a success. To just find some sort of common ground on any level as human beings, as citizens of America, as people. I think that's the best way that you can go about it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering what, if anything, you and your organization have learned from the quick legislative response in New Zealand to the recent mosque shootings, and how you might compare and contrast that with the situation in the United States.
So the New Zealand shooting actually did hit very close to home for me, because this summer, myself and a group of other Douglas students went to Christchurch, because Christchurch invited us to meet with their volunteer groups, to meet with local citizens, and truly just collaborate and discuss. I wear almost every day this Maori fish hook that was given to me by a local. And I learned in Christchurch that their discourse on guns is nowhere near the same as it is in America. I was actively told by multiple Kiwis that guns aren't an issue there, that they've never had that issue there, that they don't understand the way that we see it, the way that we talk about it as much as they want to. They simply don't understand. I think it's also important to remember that they never had that foundation that we do around guns. So for them, it wasn't as much of an issue to pass such legislation because it wasn't so ingrained in their culture and their society. There is also, of course, the fact that many of the legislators in place in New Zealand are much more on the side of gun sense. But I do think it has a lot to do with culture. It has to do with the fact that there's never been that mentality of don't take my guns away, because they understand that reasonable legislation can prevent such scenarios from happening, such tragedies from happening. I think the two are radically different. I think it did hurt to see such a change come out of Christchurch only a few days after, when we are a year and some out and we're still seeing tragedies happen frequently. But it also shows us that there is hope, be it in other countries, be it in other worlds and lands, there's still hope for change.
Here.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for your talk, if I may call it so. I wanted to make a comment or also ask a question about the illicit trafficking of these arms and the black market. Mm-hmm. Is there some kind of steps that you have thought about in terms of addressing these issues, because it's a problem that we are living in, and going back in history since the fall of USSR, there's been just trouble in tracking these arms, and so what do you have to say about that? Thank you.
The black market is a very difficult situation to navigate, because it's weird, we also keep getting this rhetoric of why bother putting laws in place if criminals are going to break them anyways and get the guns anyways. And that's kind of a weird mentality to have around laws, because why pass any laws if somebody's going to try and break them? But that's its own thing. We do have specific legislation that we've been promoting, things to prevent loopholes. Well, not necessarily distinctly the black market, things like online purchases. We need to have more distinct and clear processes on how to buy a gun online, where you cannot simply just order it to order it. Things like the gun show loophole, where you can walk in with cash, no ID, and walk out with a gun, which we've seen proven by underage people walking in with cash and walking out with an AR-15. There's also the discussion of really state-to-state gun trafficking. I know that while, yes, some states may have very strict gun legislation, the neighboring states do not, and guns can be shipped easily in and be sold on the black market. It really is a lot of different issues to navigate. It's very difficult, but I've always found that the solution is not to simply say, people are going to break these laws, why have them anyways? I think the solution is maybe look into it further. Look at it on a statewide and on a nationwide level, on a cultural level. Of course, I don't have all the answers. Like I said, I'm not an expert on gun legislation, but that's simply what we've promoted.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier to a previous question that one of the goals of your organization is to not exist at some point in the future. Like there's in some way a success metric for you guys. And I was wondering, do you guys have like what would cause you guys to say, cool, we can close up shop for the time being? Is it every state has an acceptable kind of level of legislation? Is it federal legislation? Is there a statistical marker in your mind, like if gun violence hits X, deaths per annum, then we're good? Like, what do you think?
I think for us, we've almost had a hard time just imagining a world where we wouldn't have to exist. We like to think about it that way, but in terms of specific markers, we look more at just a combination of all of it. It's not a matter of, yes, we passed these state laws, we're good, we can go home, because that's really not what it is. And there is the realistic belief that perhaps we can end most gun violence in America, but it's impossible to eradicate something completely. And it is a way of really like redefining success and looking at it and deciding when we think it's natural and organic for the march to stop existing. Because we'll keep working as long as we need to, and be that 5 years, be that 20 years. We will keep working until the people don't seem to need us anymore, until we have really achieved obsolescence almost, where perhaps we don't need to be focused so much on the NRA because the NRA is a non-issue, where perhaps we don't need to keep pushing for universal background checks so desperately because they already exist and they've already been implemented. There is no one metric for when we'll stop existing, I don't think. I think it is merely a question of what will the landscape be when we decide we don't need to necessarily pursue ourselves as an organization anymore. Ooh, lots of hands.
Go here, there, then come up.
So you are here at a university, and I'm wondering, so I'm suddenly kind of, outed as a professor, but I'm wondering what can our universities do to empower students to create change? Because we're inherently often conservative institutions. It's like we do things the same way.
Right. In my half a semester of college that I've been in so far, I'm the expert, I've learned that truly the professors have an ability where they can almost frame discussions in a really organic way. Recently, this isn't even about gun violence, this is about an issue UGA has. A fraternity had some of its members release a video of them using racial slurs. Yeah, it was very bad, and only one of my professors actually decided to take a class and talk about it. To talk about the way UGA reacted, to talk about the way the fraternity reacted, why such a thing is happening in UGA. And really, like I said, I think it's the professors' jobs to have this discourse, specifically in classes where it's applicable, in, say, a history class, a social justice class, and a peace class. Pretty much any class it is applicable. But to frame the discussion, to make sure that you can hear this diversity of thought, but also that most thoughts are valid and that there is certain perspectives that need to be considered. I have merely learned more and more about the injustices in history in my time in college because teachers talk about it. They don't provide this sanitized version of current events, of past events. They show you the brutal truth, and they are not afraid to. I think consistently professors have that ability to disperse knowledge, but also to just really allow conversations to happen in an organic and peaceful environment, because it is an environment that is much safer than many others. More hands.
Thank you for your talk. So I was wondering, do you see a future where the culture in the U.S. around guns will change?
I hope for a future where the culture in the U.S. around guns will change. I don't know how long that'll take. I know that day by day, we learn a little bit more, we change a little bit more, but I also know that since America's creation, guns have been a foundational aspect of it in both negative and positive ways. So while it may seem like an impossible task, I will never discount it because I prefer to have a little bit of optimism in America. And even if more change happens in other fronts, even if perhaps we change the discourse around young people in politics more than we do around owning guns, I think that we can take our successes where we get them. Because yes, we've seen that shift around the discussion of guns in America, but perhaps even more so, we've seen the shift around how much power people in my age demographic may have. And while, of course, we will fight for both and we will continue to fight for both, I won't discount any success where we have it, and I will keep hoping that we continue to have it. Lots of hands. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. You briefly mentioned in your speech about the relationship between masculinity and gun violence and/or gun culture. I was hoping maybe you could, I agree with you, but I was hoping maybe you could expand on that, you know, toxic masculinity / masculinity and gun culture, gun violence, etc.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'm hoping that most of you know about toxic masculinity in America and how prevalent it is. At that point, I feel it's almost a given to discuss the fact that for some reason, many different objects and cultures in America are inextricably linked to masculinity, to the idea that a man can only exist in a certain context. The only way he can be a man is if he follows certain social norms. And for some reason, guns have fallen under those social norms. I have made many friends in Georgia who grew up shooting guns. Boys, always men. It's always men who have grown up shooting guns because they've always been expected to. Because there is that mentality of protecting the home, of hunting, of being more powerful, of being able to dominate a situation because you have a weapon, because you are capable of such violence. And of course, this is toxic. This is toxic masculinity, to think that a man has to be inherently powerful or valid by having such a weapon, by being able to create such violence. But I know for a fact that the enabling of such culture has contributed directly to many mass shootings. I mean, if you look at the people who have perpetrated the mass shootings, it is almost consistently always white men. The shooter from my school was a white man. Columbine was a white man. Sandy Hook, white man. It is a pattern, and it's one that we cannot ignore. Of course, the dialogue around those men is always that they are the lone wolf, that they are the tortured soul, but really they are a part of a much broader culture that relies on so many damaging stereotypes and so many damaging norms. And I think that we need to address that for more than just the issue of guns, but for the issue of safety in America, safety for women and people of color, safety for non-binary and trans individuals. It is a huge issue. It is one that permeates all around, and it is one that is very much linked to gun violence.
Hi. So, okay, it's working. You kind of touched on it in a couple previous questions, and you also touched on it a bit in your speech. When it comes to the older generation thinking that people our age aren't as capable of having these conversations, but I find it really hard to comprehend those who are my age, who have grown up in the wake of Columbine and Sandy Hook, who have grown up around guns and don't necessarily share the same views as March for Our Lives. And I feel like it's more difficult to have those conversations with people who I would kind of expect to want this change. And I was just kind of wondering your thoughts as to if you've encountered young people who maybe disagree with you on your tours, or what advice you would have to having these conversations.
I mean, I think it's important for us to realize that not everyone will have the same reaction that people who perhaps align with the March for Our Lives do to gun violence. In fact, there has been a huge desensitization to gun violence in America, and it is everywhere. I mean, before the shooting at my high school, I was desensitized to it. I knew, even during the shooting, I knew that we'd become another statistic, that we would be one of the many who have had to experience gun violence in America. And because of that, I think oftentimes we look at it as a hopeless situation. I know that my sister, she's 13, she barely seemed to react to the shooting at my high school. She really did look at it as just another thing that happened, another thing in a pattern of tragedies. She was very much desensitized to the fact that she had to do school shooter drills in the weeks and months after. She had to hide and pretend that maybe somebody was trying to come and shoot her. She had threats to her middle school of people saying that they were going to be next, and she was desensitized to all of it because that is what our culture has perpetuated. Because we have created this system that we are only now starting to break, but barely so, of covering a shooting for a few days, then moving on. And I think that has contributed to much of people not viewing it as much of an issue. I think that it's hard to really grasp an issue like gun violence if you haven't experienced it in some capacity or come close to it or felt the empathy for it. But that doesn't mean that these people are evil. It does not mean that they are awful. And I think that to go into a discussion with somebody who doesn't agree with you, which, trust me, I've had many discussions with people my age who don't agree with me, you need to understand that maybe they're not the bad guy necessarily. Like I said before, one of our tenets is to fight the injustice, not the people. So never view the people as the problem. View the systems that have made these people feel this way as the problem. Maybe somebody thinks that the March for Our Lives is a bunch of gun grabbers because of what they've been cultured to believe. Maybe they think that the only way to really go about talking about guns in America is in the ways that the NRA enforces because they've been cultured to believe it. Don't go into it thinking that everyone is going to agree with you, because not everyone is going to agree with you. Go into it thinking, yeah, let's talk.
Hey, Delaney. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming to speak to us today. And to preface my question, I'd just like to start with a personal story. And that I'm actually from Newtown, and I was there at the time of the tragedy, and I was there in the aftermath when we tried to pass some of the tightest gun regulation in the country afterwards. Gun regulation that actually would not have stopped the tragedy. It would not have stopped the victim from obtaining the guns, and it would not have stopped some of the causes underneath the shooting. So I guess my question here is, does focusing on gun control as opposed to some of the underlying factors such as racism and mental illness, does it kind of distract us from tackling those issues and only tackling a symptom of those problems?
I think the people who consistently say that we can only talk about one of those things are the people who don't want any change to be made. I have heard that many times before, that we cannot talk about gun control and we need to talk about mental health, but we can talk about both. We can talk about every issue because every issue intersects. You're right. Racism, sexism, misogyny, mental health, they are all prominent issues that intersect with gun violence. So it would be foolish to not talk about all of them together. But it'd also be foolish to say that we can only talk about one. It doesn't make sense to me that people think that you can only talk about one. I've had many a legislator say, it makes no sense to talk about passing this law when you need to talk about mental health. And these are the people who oftentimes refuse to even acknowledge mental health as an epidemic in America, who refuse to acknowledge that we need to destigmatize mental illness. But I know that they intersect. I know that my school has a huge issue with mental health right now, to the point where 2 students recently committed suicide. I know that we need to deconstruct the way that we talk about mental health in America. I know that we need to deconstruct the way we talk about race in America. They are all prominent issues. One does not matter less than the other, but one also doesn't matter more than the other. They all have a place. It is not a zero-sum rule. We can talk about all of them. We have the ability, we have the time, we have the power. So let's stop pitting them against each other.
Hi, we already know how difficult it is for young people to be activists, but I would like to know how difficult it has been to be a young women activist in all this long struggle that you have had. We have seen a lot of news talking about you guys, and I would like to know, how do you feel about it and how hard hasn't it been?
Yeah, I mean, as my introduction so nicely said, I am a staunch feminist, and I do like to look at this through the lens of women's rights, specifically activism, because I'm not gonna lie, I have faced my fair share of sexism in both the political and social realm. I have a distinct memory of lobbying 2 weeks after the shooting in DC, and one of my colleagues, bless his heart, said, "Oh, this guy is a staunch conservative. You're a woman. You shouldn't talk during this meeting." I didn't listen. I talked the most out of everyone in the meeting because I was very adamant about the fact that I would not let my voice be silenced in any capacity. And it's something that I continue to push for every day. Because inherently, I know that there is a lot of, it's internalized, a lot of the misogyny in women and in men. And some of my dearest, closest friends have had a lot of learning to do. I have had to educate them on the fact that having, 4 guys on a panel is a little bit overkill when you have so many women in an organization. Sending a man to speak at a women's conference doesn't make sense when there's a woman who's available. But it's also, it is about navigating this very treacherous landscape where I know that some people would discount me because I am a woman. It is about navigating a landscape where I don't want to seem like I care too much about one component of the issue, but it's also an important part of who I am. I cannot ignore the fact that I am a woman, and that even in the social justice realm, sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes your voice will be silenced and ignored, but unfortunately, I have had to take on the role of educating people. They're learning on their own too. I think that everyone is constantly in a position where they should be learning a little bit more about how to be better, where they should learn about their inherent privilege, be it as a man, be it as a white person, be it as a cis person, as an able-bodied person. There is an inherent level of privilege, and really, while the oppressed should not be the ones to dissect that, sometimes it happens. That's not to say they're not good, though. I want to clarify, all of those people are lovely people who are fighting for social change. They're just in the process of becoming better.
Hi, Delaney. Over here, sorry.
Hi,
So last night we watched Under the Guns, and I learned about how the NRA had turned from kind of a gun safety organization towards really being a lobbying arm for gun manufacturers. Have y'all had the opportunity to meet directly with gun manufacturing CEOs and executives, or how have you thought about leveraging kind of pressure on that, the money and the power behind the NRA?
Right. One of the biggest things that we've had to talk about is money and power in politics. I remember finding out that fact about the NRA. I was we were meeting with Chuck Schumer, and his assistant was like, "Oh, I'm an expert on the NRA, actually," and then told us that. And it kind of shook us to our core, because to know that an organization that once was, about marksmanship, about gun safety, has turned into, I'll refrain from commenting, a corrupt organization that consistently promotes values and beliefs and policies that are damaging to people everywhere. Sorry, I'm not. I think that we are oftentimes willing to meet with nearly everyone. We have had some meetings with different manufacturers, with different people who are higher up in those fields, in those areas. But we also know that we don't need to talk to the higher up at the NRA. We talked to Dana Loesch. Dana Loesch, she's awful. That's all that there is to it. She is a fearmonger. And like I've said before, when we learn to attack the injustice and the systems of injustice, that does not mean that we have to play nice with them all the time. Because yes, conversation with people, playing nice with them, being able to discuss in a friendly and open way is necessary, but when you're talking about an organization that promotes corruption in politics, you don't need to play nice with them. You don't need to be so sociable, to be so sweet and kind, to have a sit-down meeting. You need to tell people about what they are doing. You need to make it clear that it's not okay, and you need to deconstruct the system from the outside in.
Well, you kind of already started answering my question, but you talked about the importance of being empathetic in a personal conversation, but I think one of the distinctive things about your movement was the bold speech, because the other side has often been able to own the framework around the issue and make it taboo to say anything besides thoughts and prayers. And so your movement kind of just decided we're going to break through all those taboos. And I think that's moved the needle in a way. So I just wanted you to talk about the importance maybe of bold speech in the right situations.
I remember talking about it when we went to Tallahassee in the weeks after the shooting, because they sent me up there to give a speech that I had not prepared. And I kind of started talking, and I didn't hold back. It's something that's been a huge proponent of our movement, is that we don't hold back. And the truth is, we have nothing to lose. We don't have to get reelected. We don't have a job to protect. We're a bunch of students who are angry, who want change, and aren't going to shut up about it. Because really, that's the beauty of it, is the fact that we called out thoughts and prayers because it was ineffective. Because even prominent spiritual leaders have said that thoughts and prayers are nothing if not matched with action. And that ability to be just truly brutally honest is something that I think a lot of people needed. I think it's something that's missing in a lot of political discourse, but it's become a lot more prevalent lately. It's a cultural issue, really. And the fact that we don't want to say those dirty words, we don't want to have those sticky, unpleasant conversations, but that they're the most necessary of them all. The ones that make you squirm, that make you think, oh, I don't want to be confronted with this. That's what you need to be confronted with. If we're saying something that might be considered unpleasant by some people, then we need to deconstruct why it's unpleasant. Why we don't want to talk about something, because we know it's the truth. We know that it's an unpleasant truth to confront. And really, Thoughts and Prayers was the basis of it. Knowing that it had been said so many times before that it was a Band-Aid, that it didn't do anything besides make a politician look good for a few days. It was probably the basis of a lot of our discussion. We had a lot of phrases. I mean, we pretty much operate on Emma's saying we call BS because it's true. We're calling BS every day because that's what you have to do to create some sort of change, is you have to get into the dirty stuff, and you really can't be afraid of it.
Again, thank you for your talk. I want to put together some of the things that you were saying, because I really appreciate the comments about the need to be empathetic as we're dealing with other individuals, other people, and having serious conversations with them. And I think that works in part because you're able to make a genuine connection and have shared vulnerability in terms of what we desire and our strive to get there. But when it comes to some of these different corporations or large organizations that have people in charge who are fearmongers at the end of the day, the sort of people who aren't really acting in bad faith, but are constantly pumping out information to the populace, how do you find, or what do you find to be the best strategy for dealing with the misinformation that they're putting out there, to handle it straight on with counter information where you're labeling them as fearmongers, letting the public know about them, or in having those personal conversations where you're trying to assuage people's fears and let them know that there are other sources that they can go to without directly confronting others?
So it is, in a way, a combination, because we do have to kind of assuage people's fears very often, because they will be getting that information from the incorrect source. However, a big thing that we like to do is to attack those sources, because really a corporation is not a person. It does not have the ability to be empathetic because it is a corporation and its main focus is making money. So we have had to confront them directly. My friend David, actually, I remember Laura Ingraham had a show where she was fear-mongering and presenting misinformation, so he attacked her advertisers. He got all of her advertisers to drop her, and now every time her show airs, she loses money, which is a beautiful, satisfying end to that. But we call out the misinformation where it is, because it is a huge issue in America. People like Alex Jones, who consistently promote conspiracy theories that are very damaging, who consistently promote lies, let's deplatform them. We did deplatform him. We pretty much ruined him, because just because somebody's giving information doesn't mean they have right to a platform. And what we've been able to do is to remove those platforms in the best way that we can, through grassroots organizing, through going after the advertisers, through going after the source of the money. I think for us, one of our biggest struggles almost is having to deal with misinformation and misconception of what we are and what we stand for, which is why we have to go after specific outlets and specific lies so much.
Hi, thank you for all the work that you have done. It's really amazing. So as a peace student, we learn a lot about different leaders and how they have come to be. And obviously you have gone through an experience with violence. And I realize that you rely a lot with that within your rhetoric as a leader. But I'm wondering, how did you did you have like a role model, or like who do you look up to, and how did you go about finding that person? Because you're a very articulate speaker, and obviously like that's very like applicable to all the youth and every activist to have something to have a basis for your leadership.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of powerful women that I look up to specifically. Some of my idols may include, of course, you've got like Gloria Steinem, awesome woman. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the woman that our school was named after. She was actually a prominent environmental activist who focused on protecting the Everglades. You've got people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You've even got more modern feminists. One of my heroes is Roxane Gay, who is an incredible woman who is dissecting the body politic and feminism and bad feminism. And really, they've all shown me that there is no right way to be a woman, and that however I am, whoever I am, that's okay, and talking about it is okay. And yeah, of course, there was a lot of men that I looked up to, whatever. But I definitely, as I grew more into activism and I came into it, I realized the importance of having powerful women to look up to, women who are flawed, who are human, who aren't just one thing, but are so many things, who are complex figures. And that's been a lot of why I operate the way that I do, because I want to know that if a girl decides to look up to me, that I am showing her an image of a woman that is not unattainable, showing her that it's okay to be any size, it's okay to be loud and obnoxious and talkative, it's okay to be opinionated, because that's who we are. And really that is what has encouraged me to speak out the way I do, to continue being this figure of sorts, is knowing that maybe one person will look at it and realize that they can do the same.
Hi, thanks. I've appreciated the talk and conversation so far. And you've remarked on a number of policies, a number of cultural impacts in shaping why certain civilians shouldn't have firearms. I'm curious what either your conception or the organization's conception is on firearm usage and increased militarization of police forces in the United States and police brutality.
Yeah, super important thing that people don't talk about enough is that police brutality is a form of gun violence. It is a direct form of gun violence, and if we don't address that, then we would essentially be incomplete as an organization. We would be inherently flawed if we weren't to talk about every form of it, and police brutality is a very prominent form of it. We know that organizations like Black Lives Matter have been working to combat this much longer than we have. We know that there's a lot of organizations that have been working to combat gun violence in cities who haven't been getting the same platforms as us, for a number of reasons. I mean, we rose to prominence largely because of our privilege, largely because we were more affluent white people. And we've had to become very cognizant of that, and that's why we try to pass on almost the platform. We try to pass on the platform. We have communicated and worked with and continue to work with many activists from, like I said, we have some who work for us on a national level from Arizona, from Milwaukee, from the south side of Chicago, from Harlem, New York, because they all have different experiences and they all have different areas of expertise almost. Police brutality is a huge component. The militarization of police is a huge component of gun violence, and we need to combat that too. That is merely a fact. We cannot ignore it. We cannot pretend that it's not as important, because it is there, it is valid, and it is so bad. That's the only way I can really describe it. It is an awful thing, and if we don't address it, then we aren't doing our job.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I was actually on the operations committee for our local March for Our Lives last year. So, anyway, story time. Earlier this week, my school was placed on a lockdown. It wasn't a drill, because we have drills like often, but for the first 15-20 minutes, we didn't know what was happening. It ended up not being major, but for the most part, we were all thinking, okay, what's going to happen? What's our game plan? And even not in lockdowns, for every classroom I'm in, I have like a plan on where I'm going to go. We talk about it every day. I guess my question is, how do I go about educating myself further on the issue of gun violence and the politics of it, and then using that education to educate others about it? Because I like to think I know things, but I'll be the first to admit that I don't know everything, and I would definitely like to learn more about it.
First off, thank you for talking about the lockdown, because I definitely, even before the shooting, was in the same place as you, where I had a plan for no matter where I was. where I would go to hide, be it the trunk of my car, be it inside a trash can. I had a plan for where I would hide. But on another note, information. We all like to think that we know a lot, but we all also have a lot to learn. Especially after getting to college, I was like, oh my God, I know nothing. I have so much to learn because everyone thinks that they know everything in college. Sorry, college students, it's kind of true. And really, I think a lot of people in the march, we like to read books from different people, from different leaders in the past and in the present, on the nuances of such an issue. Listening to any variety of TED Talks, podcasts, speeches from people in different communities in different areas. Just making sure that you know the issue inside and out in a way that is both intersectional and inclusive. Not necessarily listening to a very specific experience of gun violence, but as many as you can. Because really, I think, yes, it's important to know a lot about the statistics and the details of gun violence, but also just knowing about the breadth of it and how far it can spread and how much it's permeated our culture. I think that's important too. I know my friend David, he is always reading some different book that he recommends to me, and I have to explain to him that I don't have time to read those books because I'm reading other books for school. That's how he keeps teaching himself, because even though he's not in college right now, he has to keep learning, and learn he does. I'm a big proponent of reading, so that was what I would recommend first, but any outlet that you can get it from there, really.
Hi. I was also at the documentary screening of Under the Gun last night, and one thing that really interested me from that documentary was how the NRA is actually not very representative of the attitudes of a lot of gun owners in America. Yeah, and I was wondering if you could speak maybe to how like your tours or your activism and your work with local communities has maybe like engaged a dialogue with or even an unlikely coalition with like what seems like a near majority or majority of gun owners in the United States who might be more sympathetic to the fact that you're not gun robbers and have a lot of the same priorities.
We have met many a member of the NRA who supports common sense gun legislation. It is this misconception, but on both ends, honestly, that the NRA is full of people just like the people in leadership there, and that's not true. It's not true, which is why we don't attack NRA members, because we know that oftentimes they join this organization because of a cultural impulse to do so, because they want to protect their rights, but that they are not unreasonable people, that they understand that there is common sense gun legislation to be put in place, and we have talked to many of them. We have talked to people who aren't members of the NRA, who are gun owners, who agree with us fully. I know that there are people who are directly affiliated with the march, organizers on different state levels whose parents own guns, because they understand that there is common sense gun legislation that can be put into place that does not directly conflict with their Second Amendment rights, that it is reasonable, that it is logical, that it can actually benefit people to have those laws put in place. And it's not as much of an issue as people seem to think it is, because the NRA perpetuates that myth that we are, like I said, the bad guy, the gun grabber, the overreachers. It sometimes does affect different members of the NRA, but for the most part, the gun owners that we've met are completely reasonable. They are not the enemy. They've never been the enemy. Oftentimes they're on our side and they work with us consistently.
I think we can take one more question.
I saw she raised her hand.
There's 2 hands, so we'll do these 2 and then be done.
Questions.
Hello. Oh, hi. One of the really amazing things I find about the March for Our Lives movement is that it's predominantly a youth movement. So I was just wondering if you could talk about the obstacles that you face specifically as youth, specifically for youth who are not of voting age, and also how you've formed bridges with older generations.
So the March for Our Lives, in terms of student activists in the March for Our Lives, the oldest people, there's 2, we call them the old people in the group. Sorry, actual older people, because they're 21. You know, just real geezers. So they're the oldest student activists. Obviously, there are some issues that come with the fact that we're all that young, which is why as we've grown as an organization, we've had to look outwards to bring on, say, somebody who works in like organizing speaking engagements, like this very one right here. She's older than 21 because we kind of needed her to be. Because legality is a big issue. I remember when it came to pulling permits for the march, we needed to have adults do that for us because we couldn't legally, because most of us were too young. Also, a lot of members of the march are under the age of 18. There's plenty who are 16 or have just turned 16, so they are just able to pre-register to vote. And it's a little daunting to be in that position where you want to be an activist, but you can't even legally vote. But that doesn't keep you from being able to spread the message of voting, to spread the message of youth power to other people. I mean, one of my friends, he's 16, and he registered tons of people to vote this summer. He can't do it himself, but he made sure plenty of others can. And I think that it is a little bit scary to think that there's just young people and it is simply us against the world sometimes, but we've learned that that's not true. That there are many organizations with older people, like Moms Demand Action over here. We got an organization of moms, and they love taking care of us. They really do. It's so sweet. I remember when we were lobbying in DC, we didn't take care of ourselves. Teenagers aren't great at that, I'm gonna be honest. We hadn't eaten, and then they were like, oh, Moms Demand Action packed you guys little lunch boxes. And I was like, wow, there's an orange in here and everything. But on a deeper level too, there is a lot of collaboration to be had, but I think there's also power in that each of us is separate in our identities, you know? How we are an organization of youth, and we collaborate with other organizations, but their power is in their identities as well. The power in Moms Demand Action is that they are a group of moms. The power in March for Our Lives is that we are a group of students. Those are inherently different, and while we can collaborate, I think that it's important to remember that we are our own groups, we are ourselves. So we haven't necessarily had problems communicating with older people. Oftentimes they cheer us on. They love us. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten, I marched in the 60s and I'm marching with you today. Like, I would have so much money if I collected $1 every time someone said that to me. And I think that's beautiful. And I think it shows how the generational gap isn't as strong as people might think, as it might seem to be, because really it's just, we all have empathy, we're all human beings. That's kind of the core of it, is that we're all humans and we all care. What was the one other question? I know there's one last one.
So my name is Genesis. I'm from Chicago, so where I grew up, it was very there was a lot of gang violence, so I was exposed to a lot of gun violence. But I did have experience growing up. I've been an activist since I was young, just because my parents were immigrants, so my dad was the one that introduced me to it. But so at a young age, I was working with a organization in my community where they would bring it. At one time they brought up people who had left gangs and were trying to go back into communities and basically get gang members to leave the gangs. And a lot of the issues they talked about were mainly surrounding gun violence and wanting to remove that aspect from gang violence. But so can you just talk about that, or how to bridge that barrier and basically move it to you talked about
Right.
intersecting and everything. Can you talk about that?
So I remember a distinct conversation. I had it in June, but it still stands out to me today. I was talking to my friend Juan Reyes from Chicago. We were in the south side of Chicago and we were walking around, and he started talking to me about gang violence. We had the conversation about the fact that gang violence is oftentimes violence by proximity, that it is used to discount gun violence, specifically in America. It is a tool that has a lot of racist undertones, the way that we continue to perpetuate gang violence in America. And he talked to me about the fact that some of his siblings were in gangs. They were in gangs because it was the safest place to be in his area, because they only felt secure, they only felt protected if they were a part of a group that promised that. He hadn't joined a gang, but he had experienced a lot of familial and societal pressure to participate in one, because they knew that that was the only way to guarantee his safety, to guarantee that he won't get shot. Even if that isn't true, it was what they promised. It was what they had to offer, because there is a lot of systemic issues here. There is systemic issues around race and gender and sexuality and guns and all of it. And it is important to understand that we cannot look at gang violence as a way to discount gun violence, as a way to discount who continues to perpetuate gun violence. we need to look at it through that lens of intersectionality, through the lens of how can we deconstruct the systems that have created such a gang culture in America, that have created a gang culture in these cities that are underfunded, that instead of putting money into, say, a city center, put money into a police academy. When we look at those situations, when we look at how deep they really go, I believe you brought it up earlier, how it is not merely an issue of gun control legislation, it is an issue of systems. It is an issue of systemic issues in America and how we address them and how we deconstruct them. And that is a lot of work to take on. It is a lot of change that needs to happen, but it's change that we will continue to push for. Not just the march, but every organization must continue to push for. Everyone, no matter the goal, needs to push for a more inclusive, intersectional America, one that doesn't perpetuate systems of violence, systems of oppression, but rather fights them and ends them. I think that's a pretty good message to leave off with, so